Hi, Jackie. Hello from yesterday.
Yes. Good, good morning from the future. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thanks. It's brilliant to talk to you. We've swapped a few emails and social media conversations, and it's an honor to have you as a podcast subscriber too. So it's great to have you join me as a guest. Thank you so much for joining Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been a listener and admirer for a while now.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And we have another connection in common through your work with Geordie Casamajana as well, who's been a previous guest. And obviously he works
That's
with you
right.
for Vegan for the Animals. So it's great to have that connection too.
Oh, we are so lucky to have him on our team. He's kind of like the vegan godfather, really. He's we read Ethical Vegan, and we had the pleasure of interviewing him before he came on as part of our team, and we look up to him so much because he set the benchmark for us, and he really changed. It kind of made us level up as well, I think, as advocates, and just getting what that whole vegan philosophy was about and what it means to be an ethical vegan. So yeah, as we still kind of pinching ourselves, like, wow, Geordie's on our team, but we're always, every time we need to know something, Geordie, can you just clarify this for us? And we know that we're learning from the best, so it's
Yeah.
great.
No, that's a great mind. It was brilliant to have him as a guest. Yeah. So you know this already, but this is a series of conversations about, I guess, the two biggest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and who gets to matter. So epistemology and ethics, if you like. And I have an obvious bias given the title of this series, because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple, everyday philosophy or worldview called Sentientism that suggests when it comes to thinking about what's real and what to believe, we should use a naturalistic approach that's committed to evidence and reason. And when it comes to who gets to matter in our ethics, whatever those ethics are, again, the clue's in the name, all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to experience things, particularly to suffer or flourish. But I'm talking to people in these conversations, as you know, both who agree with that way of thinking and disagree with it. So it's going to be great to understand your own sort of philosophical journey and where you've got to now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself? Although we've hinted a little at your intro already.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking, how do I introduce myself? I guess I've sort of come full circle, really. So I'm head of communications, and I'm a founding board member of the nonprofit organization Vegan FTA. People always ask me what FTA means. It's vegan for the animals. It's what we're all about. So we're an online media platform for animal rights activism, and we amplify the work and voices of animal advocates around the world. And we're also an educational hub for veganism in general. I guess from the age of around 13, I became interested in animal rights, but this all ended up taking a very different turn when I ended up emigrating to New Zealand at the age of 19. And I ended up spending almost 2 decades deeply entrenched in the dairy and the beef industry. So yeah, that's a whole story in
Yeah.
itself. But I've been vegan for 5 years now, and I can't take back my time in the dairy industry, but at least as a full-time activist, my experience now has given me a very unique insight and perspective. And so these days, I spend a lot of time sharing this insight with different organizations and just encouraging bridges of effective communication, really, between vegans and animal farmers. Because I do firmly believe, I mean, you had Erin Wing on as your guest recently. I was cheering as I was listening to the podcast. I'm like, here is someone who gets it,
Yeah.
absolutely gets it. She was so bang on with everything that she said. But as a rule, I sort of firmly believe that, you cannot possibly understand the mindset and the psyche of a farmer unless you've actually been there yourself. So yeah, it's been a long way around. I sort of started off as a young activist, went as far away as possible from that, and have now come full circle back into being an activist in a big way.
Yeah, fascinating story so far. It's going to be interesting to understand how that's been shaped by and has shaped your philosophical thinking too. So let's dive into that first big question: what's real or what to believe? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in a context that was maybe supernatural or mystical or religious in some sense, or maybe it was more naturalistic, scientifically minded, atheistic, agnostic, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like. It'd be fascinating to know your epistemological story, if you like.
Oh, I've got a few years to wind back now, but it's such an interesting question. And it's only really been since I started listening to your podcast a while back that you really think about these kind of things. So for me, I spent the first 19 years of my life growing up in a tiny Hampshire village called Selborne in the UK. And Selborne is one of those places that a lot of people haven't heard of, but funny enough, a lot of people overseas have heard of, because it's famous for being the home of naturalist Gilbert White, who was around in the 1700s. I believe he was a curator as well. And to this day, he's still celebrated as one of the greatest nature writers of all time, and also the father of ecology. I think he died about 230 years ago as we speak. And even though it's been that long since his death, if you learn about him, I don't think he's ever been any more relevant than he actually is today. And his work, just talking about nature and about what he discovers about sentient beings and how animals just are. And, I think if he was around today, he and I would just get on famously. But for a kid growing up in the 70s like I did, life was pretty idyllic. We had thatched roofs, cobbled streets, very typical picture postcard England. And our community was very small and close-knit. And although my parents weren't at all religious, much of our village life really revolved around the local church. That was a real sort of hub of the community. So I was raised in a very Christian community. I attended the only school that there was in Selborne, which is St. Mary's Church of England Primary School. And every morning we would sing hymns in assembly, and every Wednesday Mr. Curtis, the local vicar, would come and visit us and share stories about the Bible, and that was just how it was. I didn't really question anything. I think we all kind of knew that, well, if you're good you go to heaven, and if you're bad then Satan's going to get you, and all of that kind of thing. Never looked into it too deeply. It was just part of life. And then as I was older, I joined the church
and at that
choir.
stage, so through some of my conversations, that's been quite common, that that was the water people swam in, and but for some people it was just an irrelevance to them. It was just, okay, people talk about this stuff, but it's not me. For other people, they just accepted it because that was what everyone said and did. It sounds like the latter was you. It was just like, well, yeah, of course this is true, right? If I'm good, that's where I'll go. And if this is bad, that's where I'll go. And there is a God up there, and just sort of accept that these things are true.
Absolutely. I think we got into that sort of idyllic vision of, God's this man that sits up on a cloud and, just watches over everyone. He's got a big flowing beard and all of that kind of stuff. But I think you're right. I mean, in the case of me with, I was an only child as well. Still am an only child. And so it was also, I guess it was that kind of wanting to fit in as such. I don't think any of my group of friends, I don't know if any of us were particularly religious, but that was just how it was. That was how we were raised. That's how our community was. And nobody ever questioned that.
And your parents weren't religious. So was it something you discussed, or did they feel any tension with the fact you were going through a sort of religious schooling, or was it, for them, it was just, this is just the way it is?
I think it was just the way it was. It wasn't that my mum wasn't religious. She always said she believed in something.
Yeah.
But she wasn't sure what exactly.
Yeah.
She always sort of said that she had some faith. Dad really wasn't. It wasn't something that we ever talked about. He actually passed away when I was about 24. He had cancer, and our local vicar then, I went back to the UK, which we'll get to where I came from, but well, I went back to see him 25 years ago. He's been gone this year, and he passed away from cancer at 57, which was rather unfortunate. And that was the only time where I saw him actually accept that kind of help, assistance, whatever you want to call it. That kind of presence in his life was when the local vicar, Mr. Curtis, had moved on from our school visits, and we had another vicar, but he actually reached out to my dad and did come and visit him during those last few months of his life, which was lovely. But apart from that, it wasn't a big presence in our home. My nanny, my mum's mum, she was paralyzed, and so she was very devout Catholic. So I think she had to be, I'm talking to my mum, she had the whole rosary, she had the, the wee shrine in her bedroom and things like that, which again, wasn't something I questioned. It was just how Nanny was, and it's just mum said to me years later, she had to have something. She had to have faith because she hadn't been able to walk for years, so that was something for her. But for me, I think you're right. It was a kind of young fear of FOMO as well, that whole fear of missing out, because I was an only child. Everybody went to church on Sundays. The church, there was only 28 of us in our whole school as well. So it was, it was really small community. And I don't recall even the headmistress of our school. She had a lot of influence on me, but I don't recall that being a religious influence as such. I think just, it was the way things had always been. And the vicar would always come and talk on a Wednesday and that kind of thing, and make up stories. And we really enjoyed having him there because he was great at relating to kids. And so that was, it was quite an enjoyable part of the week. But then when I got older, I joined the church choir, and I got a lot more involved in the religion side of things, but I wasn't actually religious myself. But what happened was as I said, my headmistress had a great influence on a lot of us, and we all ended up, because of how she was, I was extremely musical. So that was, everyone that went to Selborne School ended up leaving, going to secondary school, and we were all brilliant at English and art and music, and absolutely rubbish at maths and science. It was the way that we were.
Yeah. Oh, you're another Selborne one, right? Yeah, and they would know.
It was so much like that. It was so much like that. It was just part of the course of her, but which was great for me because I had that sort of innate interest and I suppose ability as well. So, for me, joining the church choir, it gave me the opportunity to sing more, which was all I wanted. I didn't care what I sang as long as I got to sing, but it wasn't a part of going to church on Sundays. And, we sounds dreadful now, but I had my little red robe on and everything. And I make this sort of, not a pretense, but the show of being, yes, very devout, and like butter wouldn't melt in my mouth, vegan butter, of course, but back then. And it was, I wanted to go so I could sing, but it was also very much being an only child, and the fact that all my friends and their big sisters were in the choir. That was another 2 occasions on which I could have social interaction. We'd go to choir practice on a Thursday night, and we would have the service on Sundays, and then we'd go and play afterwards and that kind of thing. So that was about, as far as things went when I was younger. And then even when I got to secondary school, music sort of dominated my life even more. So I was in every choir that there was, despite, failing maths twice miserably. I still had it up there with the music and the English. And I spent the next 5 years or so sort of singing, well, at least 5 years, singing madrigals, cantatas, and a lot of chamber and sacred music. And again, wasn't really paying too much attention to what I was singing, just that I was singing. And I really didn't care. And my entire career as a music teacher.
They've got some good tunes. Yeah.
It was cool, and I was a bit of a music snob. I was taught to harmonize from before I was sort of even 7 years old. So I lived, life was that way. Everything was done in harmony, and everything was just a bit posh compared to your average sort of primary school kid, I suppose. And so
how do you feel about being my first guest to sing on the podcast?
Oh, gee. It's 20 past 6 in the morning, Jamie, and I'm going to make that my excuse. But
all right, fair enough.
One day, you never know, one day. But I just love singing. I still do love to sing. It's only been the past few years that I haven't really been singing, and my husband always said, he'd love to hear me sing more because he knows that I'm happy when I'm singing. So, but yeah, that was it. I never had a reason not to believe in God. It was just a part of my whole growing up experience. And he'd been pretty good to me, really. So I had no complaints.
Yeah. And you mentioned at a point you were no longer religious. Is that fair to say? How did that transition happen? Was it something that faded or shifted gently, or was it there's sort of a period of reckoning where you actually thought things through and challenged it, or how did that shift happen?
Yeah, that was a big shift. So I have undergone a big shift in general, I suppose, from where I was then to where I am now. So I guess the real catalyst was when my first son Luke was born. He was born on my 22nd birthday in 1994, which should have been a good thing, but unfortunately he passed away 2 days later. And obviously that was it for me. He would have been 27 if he was still here. And it was that was a fright. I had a healthy pregnancy, and I thought I hadn't been pregnant before, so I figured everything was pretty much going well. And he was born 6 weeks premature, which would have been technically in this day and age, it's not a problem, as if, babies that are 15, even more weeks premature, and the wonders of technology and medical care, you can get them, it's not a huge thing. He was born a healthy weight, and technically should have survived. Unfortunately, what the doctors didn't realize was I was carrying a bug, for more a better description of the word, called strep B, which about 25% of adults can have at any one time and not know, but it's absolutely deadly to babies. And so while Luke was being born and had a rather traumatic delivery because he was early and everything, I had passed it on to him. So by the time he made it into the world, he just didn't have a hope. So that was it for me. Sort of when you're younger and you sort of stop and think to yourself, well, if God loves us all and so much and watches over us and all of that, how come there are these bad things happening like wars and bombings and earthquakes, which I'm very used to now here in New Zealand, and all of that bad stuff, it does occur to you, but you're like, too big to deal with. I can't answer that. So I'm not going to keep thinking about it. So on the one hand, I was quite philosophical. I remember having the neonatal counselors, I think they call them SANS, stillbirth and neonatal death syndrome. They rang me about a few days after it happened, and I came home. And I obviously did such a great job of sounding okay that they asked me if I would like to come and counsel other parents that had been through the same thing. And I thought, that's not really quite honest. I declined, I was like, no, I've got enough to be going. That was a bit rough. I obviously did a great job of it, but on the one hand, I was quite philosophical because I'm a believer in whether it's good or bad, things happen for a reason. And even if I don't know what the hell that reason is, for some reason, Luke just wasn't destined for this earth. And I was okay with that, as okay as you could be. From now on, I was the mother of an angel baby, which was, it's okay. It was something pretty special, I guess. I told myself that, well, I was pretty honored to be chosen as his mother, even if he wasn't destined to stay with me. And there was nothing that I could do to change that. But as far as God was concerned, any shred of belief that I ever had after that just went straight out the window. That was it. And from then on, I ended up on a very different path. Which, I don't know if you want to talk about that as well. But
it's absolutely. I mean, it'd be great to know the full journey up to how you think about these things today.
Crikey, I don't know how many guests you've had like me too. I haven't listened to all your podcasts yet. I've heard a lot of them, but I'd never sort of considered myself a remotely spiritual person. I'd never even thought about it. But about 3 weeks after Luke's death, I had some really strange and unexplained things that started happening. Really, you just couldn't explain them. I don't know whether I can talk about them or there's nothing scary. But I'm aware it's a really different thing to talk about. But I was in what would have been Luke's room about 3 weeks after he'd passed away, and I'd finally got the strength to put away all the baby clothes and things like that, and be like, no, you've got to take charge of this. You've got to move on. And so I sort of braced myself. And I remember sitting on the floor in his room, and it just had this nice kind of smell because I just tried to make it all perfect as you could, and I was just sitting there, just quietly, just putting the clothes away and putting that part of my life away as much as I could. And there was a little dragon clock that I bought in Selborne. Well, around that, I bought in from the UK with me, and it was on the wall of my room when I was a child, and it was bright green dragon, which I absolutely loved. And it had a little head that moved sideways. So when the clock was ticking, the head would move from side to side. But anyway, this darn clock, I'd never been able to get it to go since I put it up in Luke's room. And, it was just there sort of for ornamental. But as I sat there on the floor, the dragon clocks, the head started to move on the wall. I've never really spoken to anybody about this apart from my husband, but which you kind of think, okay, well, that can happen. The clock started again, but there were no batteries in the clock. And I just remember sort of thinking, what the hell? What the actual and it kind of freaked me out. I remember leaving the room.
I can imagine.
I was completely by myself. There was nobody else that knew the significance of this clock or anything. And I just thought, wow, this is kind of strange. So there was the clock. And then there was another thing. My mum sent me this little handcraft musical carousel that she sent it to me all the way from New Zealand, where I now was, from England. And I'd never wound it up. But this carousel had a strange habit of starting to play by itself. After months, nobody would touch it. It was just on a shelf, nobody would touch it. And it had this strange habit of starting to play randomly at different really weird times, like birthdays, when it was Luke's birthday, it would start to play randomly. And I sound crazy. And I would have thought that, I explained it to my mum, and it actually happened to her one night. I went on to have two more sons, and she was babysitting for me one night over here in New Zealand. She'd also emigrated. And I went out for the evening and came home, and she was really quite shaken because it would have been my father's birthday. And she'd been sitting there watching TV. The children had long gone to bed, and the carousel started playing. And this was high on the shelf. Nobody touched Luke's carousel. It was a precious, precious thing. And so it was just, we couldn't explain it. Nobody could. And it was after that I just started thinking, well, I think we all have those kind of reasons that, again, something's happened for a reason, and I don't know what it is. My dad was not remotely religious, like I said. He would have never have believed in all of that, woo-woo stuff, as I'm sure he would have called it.
Would he have been like the hardened skeptic talking about breezes through the window or coincidences or, the proclivity of the human mind to spot patterns where there might not be? He would have been, hard skeptic, would he?
I think so. Yeah. And he, as I got older, my dad was a very interesting man. He was somebody that knew a little bit about a lot of things. He never professed to know anything, everything about everything, but he knew he was a lot more complex than I sort of took him to be. And I realized that as I got older and after he passed away, really. I still miss him a lot. But yeah, the fact that this kind of stuff was happening on my dad's birthday, it was really weird. And there were other sort of things that affected both mum and me. And, there was no logical explanation, but I think, people listening might be like, well, you believe what you want to believe. And maybe that was just me, but it was kind of like, well, maybe there is something greater out there. Maybe this isn't the end, not God, no way, because I'm done with him, but some kind of higher power, there's something. And so I didn't try and understand it. I just thought, well, that's pretty cool. I just went with it. So that was it. And so I didn't go on a deeply spiritual trail or anything like that, but I guess I got a lot more interested in, the beyond whatever we had, and just develop that awareness that, perhaps this wasn't the end, and that there was some other kind of realm out there.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you. So you went from classically Christian to non-religious to maybe there's something more beyond the natural world that we don't understand that has influences, and who knows? Is that sort of roughly where you've got to?
I've kind of gone beyond there as well.
Where next? Yeah.
That was with me for a few years, and then it wasn't really until I'd been vegan for a couple of years that I became interested in Buddhism and and practicing the Dharma as much as I am able. I'm still very much learning. There's so much in Buddhism that it's you're constantly learning. But as a philosophy, as a way of being, it appealed to me for some years. But just as I once thought veganism was, I imagined it to be too hard, too limiting. Well, if you're a Buddhist, you can't do this, you can't do that. It's too restricting, too pure. There's too many things that you can't do. But there was always something in my mind, just this back of my mind, that it was just a bit of a flicker that wouldn't go away, that I kept coming back to. And one day in desperation, I wrote to a Buddhist temple and said, I really want to be a Buddhist, but, I can't. I'm so frustrated because my life situation right now is just so hard. It doesn't make it possible. I've got all these responsibilities that I can't leave, and I don't know how to meditate, and I can't come to a retreat, and there's no temples near me. Like, I just, I thought you had to go through the whole.
I bet they loved receiving that letter. It's like.
It's like, how many excuses are there not to be vegan? It was the same thing. Well, I've got this and this and this, and it's all just stacking up against me, they must have loved it. And I mean that
genuinely. I think I can imagine them picking this up and going, this is exactly the sort of woman we want to talk to, right? About the journey, and it's, and achievement, and ticking boxes, and this is not what it's about. I mean, you can probably tell me.
Definitely. And no, you're right. And, I've been through the whole, I guess, midlife crisis and the whole eat, pray, love moment. I even had Elizabeth Gilbert's Attraversiamo on my hand, because it was that kind of message that I wanted to carry with me. I was like, this is what I need to do, to discover myself and to be comfortable with who I am. I need to, I need to go away. I need to go and find an ashram or something like that, or go and spend 6 weeks in a silent retreat and that kind of thing. And I was really frustrated that I couldn't do that. And so one of the monks very kindly wrote back to me after several weeks, apologized for being very busy doing monk stuff. And he said, as you do. And he just said, my dear, you can certainly be a practicing Buddhist. All you have to do is just be kind. And I thought, oh, well, I can do that. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. And then a long-term friend of mine, when I said I didn't know how to meditate, he just said to me, start by looking at the end of your nose and just concentrating on the end of your nose. And so I did that. I could do it here and go cross-eyed. But that was what got me into meditation. It's one of those things that I never, ever imagined that I would be doing. It's like, I liken it to Game of Thrones, right? I never watched Game of Thrones. I'm sorry, I've never seen Game of Thrones. I saw a bit of it. I didn't like it because I don't like buying into the whole hype of things. I don't like going with trends, and I don't like doing things just because other people do. So if meditation is suddenly cool, I'm not going to be doing that.
So you're not a vegan Buddhist because it's cool and edgy?
No, I wouldn't it be cool? Like, no, not for that. And now I feel like it's the perfect, it just goes hand in hand. I feel, that whole holistic way of being. But, and yoga was something I never, ever thought I'd be doing, because I thought it was for bored housewives in leotards, that kind of thing. The fact that people have been doing it for centuries, it didn't occur to me that there might be something in it. But all of that kind of stuff, I realized that I've sort of been robbing myself of the benefits for years. But so that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, fascinating. And I can see how that would be quite a good fit because, again, I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but it doesn't have this deity, right? It doesn't have an all-powerful, omniscient, supposedly benevolent deity. That's just not part of it. Buddha was a man. It has this... some people take it in quite a naturalistic direction. So they just think of it as a life philosophy with no supernatural, whereas other aspects of Buddhism do have, karma and reincarnation and, in a supernatural framework to it as well. But I get the sense that even that sort of gentler supernatural framework probably fit your sense of there being something out there better than, another type of deity or another flavor. So I can see how that fit would work. And just while we're still sticking on this sort of what's real and what is the nature of reality question, has your development of thinking about Buddhism changed the way you think about the supernatural? Or would you still think of it in that same sense of, I think maybe there's something out there and some sense of greater purpose, but I don't really know what it is? Or has Buddhism crystallized that or changed that for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's something that I still believe is there.
Yeah.
I think like a lot of people, I mean, my dad's been gone 25 years this year and Luke's been gone 27. And I feel them with me stronger now than I ever did as the years have gone on, which is strange. I remember seeing photos of Luke and being almost quite obsessed with it because, what if I forget what he looks like? That was a very real fear for me. I never wanted to forget what he looked like. But you don't, you just don't. Any loved one, you don't. And you hold them in your heart. And I am a lot more at peace with things. And you're right about the whole Buddhism thing. What I liked about it was that it wasn't a religion. You weren't praying to one deity. It was just a way of life. It was a way of being. It was just teachings, it's like, this has worked for me. And I liked that, and that it didn't, not preachy. And, the Buddha never was touted as being something else other than a man, a teacher. And that's what I liked about it. And it was just a way of being, which made total sense.
It's practical, it's pragmatic, it's grounded in daily life as well. And
It really, really is. And I think, like I said, I'm still learning, by the time you start with the noble truths, you've got the four noble truths and you get to the end of them and you've
The
got
Eightfold
the
Path
eightfold
and
path. And it's like, oh my Lord, how am I going to remember all this? So it's taken time for me but I think there is such synergy between Buddhism and veganism. There really is. The whole idea of suffering and what creates suffering. And it's just that how it is,
yeah.
how life is, how things are. And that helps me to deal with a lot of things better, I believe, as an advocate too.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's been a fascinating journey from, a sort of classical religion that you were given rather than chosen, to non-religious, to maybe spiritual but not religious, to Buddhism. So it's been a fascinating journey. And let's come on to this second big question now, which is what matters. And it's interesting in a way because a sort of boring, straightforward atheistic naturalist like me often gets the challenge, right? Well, okay, where do your ethics come from? Because if there isn't a God and a religious book with a load of lists of rules, and you don't have the threat of heaven or hell, where do your ethics come from? And I have a particular answer to that, as you know, grounded in a choice to care about the experiences of others, right? Which almost definitionally seems to be about morality. But it's interesting because I think someone who's spiritual but not religious, or actually someone who's Buddhist, can sometimes face the same challenge. There isn't a deity that's defining what you're supposed to be doing. So what do good and bad actually mean to you? So it'd be interesting to know your answer to that question of what matters. And again, how has it shifted through time?
Wow.
What do good and bad even mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think good and bad to me, like I said, when I was a kid, it was just, if you're good, you went to heaven. If you're bad, you went to hell. And that was it, and I think a lot of us
what determined how are you going to be judged? How would actions or people be assessed as to whether they were good or bad? What was that in your head? Because good and bad is one thing, but what did good and bad mean when you were a child?
I suppose not being mean.
Yeah.
But it was the big stuff as well, isn't it? It's like, it's not killing. It's not, if you kill someone, well, you're going to go to hell. Or if you, it was the big stuff. It was the big stuff. And heaven knows what we think of that now, because the world has changed a lot since the 70s. I mean, I remember growing up, we had the Falklands War was a big thing. You had Reagan and Gorbachev and all of that kind of stuff. It was there in your life, and it was very scary, but so far removed from anything that was to do with how we were. And so it was like, well, everyone's going to go to heaven then, because we don't do big stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whereas now I don't think that there is a hell. I guess if you want to look at it from a vegan point of view, I mean, the hell is the non-human animals that we share the planet with. That to me is hell. I don't think as humans, for a lot of us, we don't know what hell is, and that's inflicted upon them. That's not something that they do to cause that. Whereas, when I was a kid, it was always what you do, your actions determine whether you go to hell or not.
So when you were a kid in that Christian context, it sounds like good and bad were about, kindness and compassion versus not harming or hurting others. It was more that. It wasn't about obedience to God necessarily being what determined where you'd go. It was about compassion and how you treated others. Is that fair to say that's how you interpreted it?
Yeah, you're probably right, especially with the lessons from Mr. Curtis on a Wednesday. It was very...
Because for some others, it is, yes, they'll talk about kindness and compassion and harm and how you treat others, but ultimately the reason is because God tells you to be good and bad. So ultimately, obedience and compliance is really what counts, not compassion. But it doesn't sound like that was something that came through the way you were taught about Christianity. It was more about compassion and...
Yeah, I think you're right, definitely. I mean, I actually took my sons. I went on to have two more sons, as I said, and I took them out of primary school because they had a very different vicar to Mr. Curtis, who they were literally coming home from school and saying, God's going to strike me down if I do this. And I was like, hang on, no, I'm not. This is not cool. So that was different. Mr. Curtis, I think they were actually published and I've yet to find them, but he had a wonderful way. He was a father of 2 sons himself, and he had a wonderful way of relating with kids and incorporating the stories from the Bible into, just everyday life and everyday people. So there was a wee character that he invented called Fred. And so we used to love the Fred stories because we didn't realize that we were actually learning about the Bible. We just wanted to hear about Fred. And so Fred's stories actually ended up being published somewhere. They're out there. I know people that I went to school with that have seen them. And so, yeah, it was a very gentle introduction. And you're right. It was about treating people well rather than, you'll be struck down if you do this and that. And I think what I love about Buddhism is it doesn't tell you any of that stuff. It's about being your own boss. It's being accountable for yourself and, just living. You can't really control how other people treat you, but I do believe that if you are good and compassionate and kind, that does come back to you. And I've been through some hideous times. We all have been through hideous times and very traumatic times, and have really had times in my life that I've had nothing. And those have been the times that I've probably felt the richest, because that's been at the time that I've been my most authentic and maybe the most vulnerable, but also the most open. And I think that is when things come back to you tenfold. I've been incredibly lucky as well. I mean, most people would sort of think, you've lost a child, that's the worst thing that can happen. It's like, it's not something that you get over with. It still affects me deeply. But life has also been so wonderful, at the same time. And so I just like that the whole Buddhism is a way of being. It's not judging. It's taught me not to judge other people, or I try not to, at least anyway, because it's brought a lot of peace and that whole compassion. I don't walk around sort of resonating, tranquility. Far from it. My husband will tell you that, not at all. I'm still a bit of a stress bucket, and probably swear too much and all of that kind of thing. But when it comes to, for example, judging people that other people would deem bad or non-vegan or aren't the same place as me, I try not to judge them, because it's not healthy. It's not achieving anything. But you can't control anything. I mean, it's like with everything that's been going on in the world, and it continues to escalate. It brings me a lot of peace in that, if you conduct yourself, we can't control the world. We can't control everything that is happening. And yes, there is a lot of bad stuff out there that would do our heads in if we thought about it too much. But we can control how we carry ourselves. We can control, I've got this tiny wee house. You can see half of my house behind me. I can control what's happening there. I can go outside and I can feed the birds, and I can.
Even Gareth.
That brings me a lot of peace. Even Gareth. Gareth's pretty hard to control. Yeah, he will. Yeah. He's my wild Welshman, bless him. But no, he's a big teddy bear. But yeah, he is. And I think he's the same as well. We've sort of been through a lot of this journey together at various parts, and he's a sort of metalhead vegan and goes against all the stereotypical vegans that are dying of protein deficiency and all of that. But it's I get a lot of peace from it, and I think that's how I get through is being kind, and I can't control what anybody else is doing.
That's fascinating. Thank you, because there's so much within the religious way of thinking. There's so much flexibility about how you can play that ethical story through, because one is just to reinforce universal compassion, and you can tell the right stories around that, and that's the center. But as you hinted at, maybe the fire and brimstone guy was more along this track. It can be a little bit, there is compassion there. But if you step off the path, or if you're the wrong sort of person, or you break the rules, or you're in the out group, you'll roast in hell for eternity, which is a very different form of ethics, which to my mind is not consistent with the idea of a compassionate, benevolent God at all. So there's a lot of flexibility there, as good and bad. But it sounds like you got the sort of more compassionate version of that through those Christian teachings, and that's really carried through to today. It's about compassion and kindness, considering the other.
Definitely.
And
Definitely.
But also, as you've hinted at, having compassion even for other people you think are wrong or doing harm, but also having compassion for yourself in the way you carry yourself through the world. And that, there's only so much you can do, and you have to manage your expectations of yourself. And is that a fair
Yes, yeah, I think so. And I think being compassionate towards yourself is the hardest thing to do. I think it's a lot easier to be compassionate to other people than it is to actually show kindness to yourself. And I'm still very bad at that,
Work in progress.
Um, yeah, it has to be a very conscious thing, Jack, remember to be kind to yourself today, But I think it's helped a lot in my advocacy, particularly with my years in dairy farming and understanding people who have been entrenched in that system that results in such cruelty, such suffering, such inhumanity. That yes, it is what they are doing is evil, but you can't necessarily just write somebody off as being inherently evil. Everybody has a reason why they are the way they are. And just as we're having this conversation today, everyone has a reason for that. And just as I was entrenched in the industry for so long, that is how you get, and you think that this is how things are. This is, I mean, when I was farming, this is how, yes, things are sad, yes, it's not nice, but this is the way it has to be. So I was taught that constantly. And so I know when I'm advocating with farmers for better communication and things like that, I see a lot of vegans saying, oh, animal abusers should burn in hell and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, what they do is wrong. It's awful. The suffering that is inflicted is beyond our worst comprehension and imagination. And heavens, if the shoe was on the other foot, and what happened to animals is also happened to us, it just wouldn't happen. But you can't, like I said, everyone's got a reason for being the way that they are, and you can't discount that, or the entrenchment, the conditioning that people have.
That could have been any of us in a sense, and
absolutely,
and it was you, right? So yeah,
it was me. That's right. I mean, I started off speaking up for animals, and then I got entrenched in exploiting them for years. And
maybe, I mean, that's a good link into the second part of this ethics question, because we talked about what matters and centering, I guess, on compassion and comparing for others. But then the next critical question is, okay, who gets to matter in that way of thinking? Because nearly everybody feels some compassion for somebody. Even serial killers often love their mothers if they haven't killed them. But there's this sense of how far should our moral scope go out? So that would be interesting to know that story for you, particularly when it comes to thinking about distant humans and humans in general, but also critically with this idea of how do we think about non-humans, and how did you go through that journey? Again, from childhood, if you like, you can go back as far as you like to the.
I remember, I don't know, I guess my parents must have done a fairly all right job. I had a very idyllic childhood, very, very happy childhood. And although I was an only child who desperately wanted brothers and sisters and didn't understand that, my parents would have quite liked them as well. I was always, I remember people and my parents always saying, they were always struck by how generous I was, and how, maybe generous. And I always wanted to share things, and it wasn't always all about me, which is nice, because I feel, it often is. I say to my husband all the time, oh my God, I'm so it's all about me, and I should stop moaning about this, that, and the other thing, So, and we have that. We're not, like I said, we're not supposed to show ourselves compassion. We forget to show ourselves compassion, and we forget to be kind to ourselves, or under today's pressures and that kind of thing. I think we can either go one way or the other. There are people that focus purely on themselves, and then people that focus purely on others. And I think that is, I kind of got to be like that from a fairly young age, I suppose. I remember I first went vegetarian I remember clearly actually killing a spider in my room when I was 8 years old. And, over here, New Zealand spiders are quite, I'm allowed to say wussy. I'm not scared of spiders over here in New Zealand. They're spindly. They're not scary. In New Zealand, in England, when I was growing up, big hairy spiders, they were the ones that were always, above me when I was in the bath growing up, and that kind of thing. No,
another critical difference between New Zealand and Australia.
Yes, exactly. And the spiders are different. The water goes down the plug hole the wrong way, and all of that kind of stuff, which I never even realized. But yeah, so, I remember being in my room when I was 8 years old, and there was a spider, and it wasn't even a big spider, but I was just terrified of spiders. And so I got a book. I was a huge bookworm, and I squished the spider against my wall, and I took the book away, and the spider was on my book. And I just remember being mortified, absolutely mortified. Like I had actually ended that life. And I've never forgotten it. I'm turning 49, I am. And I've never forgotten that I took the life of this spider and that I could have avoided doing that. And that was, it's weird how that's never left me, and I still beat myself up over that poor spider. It was just doing its thing, trying to be a spider. I've learned so much from Geordie Casamajana about insects and just respecting every little life. Gareth, and Gareth is my husband's actually got a bee card in his wallet. It's a bright orange card because he loves rescuing bees that are on the pavement, when we're out walking, and he knows that he can get bees to come onto this orange card and he'll go and carry them to safety. So through Geordie as well, we've got this wonderful relationship with insects, but I obviously didn't back then. Not that spiders are insects, sorry, arachnids.
Yeah.
But that was the start of my just realizing that it's not all about me, and that I actually, what I do matters. And then the International Fund for Animal Welfare, I4, I remember when I was about 13 and I got a flyer through the mail, and it had a picture of the beautiful big molten-eyed baby seals. And that was when I first learned about seal clubbing. And I was absolutely horrified. And so I signed up to their newsletter and started speaking out about that quite vocally. And then from there, I went to, I remember in 1987, that was when I went vegetarian. And it was Juliette Galetly, from the founder of Viva, who I had the privilege of interviewing last year. I didn't realize, but she was the one whose campaign, her Scream campaign, resulted in me and a lot of other school kids at that time going vegetarian, where it lifted the lid on factory farming. And so that was when I realized that it was a different kind of bad stuff happening in the world. It wasn't all about wars and, Gorbachev's going to drop a bomb and rule, because that was the big thing. But when I was growing up, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, hang on, there are people that that are lower down. They're not presidents or prime ministers that have this power over others. And
was it just intuitively obvious to you that non-human animals' suffering mattered as well as human suffering? Did you just see them as sort of the same thing, or did that take it a while before you registered it? It sounds like it was quite intuitive and direct, like you're just another experiencing being. And
it was, and I think I didn't quite get the fact that animals and humans were on the same plane as such, but it was more, I couldn't believe that humans could be so cruel.
Yeah.
And then when I went vegetarian,
sorry to interrupt you yet again, but
there you go.
But that's a really interesting distinction, and I think it's an important one as well, because there are at least a couple of ways into this. One is seeing the human cruelty and reacting to that, and the other one is a direct empathy for the victims. And they can mesh together sometimes, and sometimes they come together. Often they come together. But I think there also can be quite distinct themes as well, because there are some people who are so focused on the human cruelty that once the human cruelty is removed in some way, they no longer feel the same empathy for the suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And funny enough, my father, he'd, from as long as I can remember, he loved going shooting on a weekend. He was usually one of the beaters. He was great friends with the gamekeeper. That was actually my first experience of activism. I thought all activists were bad because my dad was walking through the woods one Sunday, and some animal rights activists mistook him for being part of a hunt that was passing through, and so actually attacked my dad with a stick and knocked him to the ground. And he made the local paper.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, oh, these naughty activists, they're really bad and they cause harm and they're really extreme, And the thing that my dad was most upset about was he probably was only in his 40s at the time, and he was described in the paper as an elderly gentleman was attacked. So that hurt his pride more than anything, I'm not elderly. But my dad also had a bit of that as well, in that, even though there was love, it was nothing more that he loved going out and shooting. It wasn't the shooting that he loved, it was being out in nature.
Yeah.
It was, he used to take me up to see the badger setts in England, or the deer and things like that. And he taught me so much about nature. And it was like he very rarely used to shoot things himself. Because he was friends with the gamekeeper. I always remember coming home and there'd be a brace of pheasants, 2 pheasants being hung up in the porch, ready for my mum to pluck. But despite him going out and walking for miles with the gun, he couldn't shoot rabbits. And there were so many things. He was part of that culture, but he didn't like causing any suffering or doing any of that killing himself. And I think it was the same with me from a young age. I ate chicken and beef, but I somehow connected that pork was pig and that lamb was lamb. And so I absolutely refused to eat them. I never would. So much to the extent that my mum actually would lie. And so I'd be in the supermarket and, one of my favorite Sunday roasts, we had a traditional Sunday roast like many families. And I'd say, "What's for dinner, Mum?" And she'd say, "Leg of beef." I didn't know there was no such thing as leg of beef. She was feeding me lamb. And she was actually, I was really, really not happy about, we were in the supermarket one day and I was able to read at that stage. And I was like, hang on, that's not leg of beef in the trolley. And so naturally, so my dad had that as well. And like a lot of us do, some animals are more considered than others. And so he was a very, very peaceful man. I wish he was still here. We'd have some great conversation. I reckon he could be a brilliant vegan, because he was open to so much and would have just got it, I really think.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was, when I went vegetarian, I sort of came home from school with this scream flyer and said, "That's it, the horrors that are going on. I'm not having a bar of it. I'm not having anything to do with it." So I went vegetarian. Naturally, you can imagine my mum after lying about beef and lamb, she would try and make all my favorite things to try and coax me back, and was convinced that I would die of malnutrition and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think I got quite disillusioned quite early on in that. So once I went vegetarian, I immediately wanted other people to know about it, because it wasn't just me that got this flyer at school. We all got the same flyer at school.
Yeah.
And so all of my school projects, I started learning more about vivisection, about the Dre's test and all of these kind of things. And so all of my school projects and presentations started going on, being about animal rights subjects. And I couldn't understand why my other friends weren't doing the same. We all know this. We've all got these flyers. We can all see it's happening. And I'm telling you this stuff. Why is it not wrong to you? Why don't you care? Everyone was just so apathetic. And I suppose like the average teenager, I'd be there with my overhead projector and my marker pens and, saying how it is. And everyone's just sort of sitting back, just chewing gum kind of thing, just not really wanting to be there. And, I've learned now that we're not all on the same path at the same time, obviously. And it's different messengers for different people. But yeah, that was my first sort of foray into activism, I think. And I think, maybe there is just something naturally there. And as I found out when we went, when I ended up on a dairy farm, that what we are born with can be buried so easily and so deeply.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing that's fascinating, because you went from this stage of actually being an animal advocate, in a sense, based on that compassionate ethic for other sentient beings, and you ended up on a dairy farm. And I mean, the practical story is really interesting as well, and you might tell some of that as you go through it. But I'm also interested in the philosophical and the mental journey you went through as well, as you ended up working in that situation and came out of it at the back end, without sort of psychoanalyzing you. It's a fascinating journey as to how you went through those changes of thinking.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure if I'm answering your questions as succinctly as I should, or if I'm wavering off the path.
No, it's great. It's great.
I guess I should probably sort of say how I ended up on the farm in the first place. So like I said, I grew up in Selborne, this very quaint English village. And when I was 19, I pulled a very classy move and ran off with the local barman, who was a Kiwi from the pub. And so I landed in New Zealand, in the Waikato, which is deep in the heart of rural farming country. And in Selborne, there was, behind our garden, we were very quiet sort of beautiful garden that we had, and it backed onto a farm, a grazing farm. And so there were cows in the field, and I used to be terrified of cows growing up because, they were huge, and I didn't realize that there were actually cows in existence. I thought they were all bulls, and our friends, we'd dare each other to, go in the field where the bulls were. And because, we thought they'd all try and chase us, didn't realize that they were curious, and just wanted to check us out. And so for me to be suddenly working with these animals that I was scared of, terrified of, because they're huge when you get up close, that was, I never planned to be doing it, but I quickly sort of got entrenched. My partner at the time, he was from a dairy farming background. He'd grown up, his parents had a dairy farm. And so he'd been in England for about a year and decided he wanted to come back to New Zealand. And that was the easiest thing. It was in the 90s at the time. And that was when dairy farming was the ultimate career for a young person in New Zealand. It promised security. It promised, you could climb the ladder. You just didn't have to worry. I didn't know anybody around us, any other young people that didn't want that, because it was just, you couldn't fail. Who knew you couldn't fail as a dairy farmer? Who knew what was going to happen? But that was something that we all aspired to, or at least I ended up aspiring to. And so for me, it was a great novelty to start with. I didn't have a work permit for the first year. And so I was just sort of playing, really. I was a bit bored and just being on the farm. I'd go out on the motorbike and that kind of thing. And yeah, it was very clean, green kind of environment. And I was like, oh, if my friends could see me now, I'm on a motorbike, I'm getting my hands dirty, I'm treading in cow pats, and this is so opposite from the little girl that, was always made up to the nines and never liked getting dirty and all of that kind of thing. So I took a kind of pride in it to begin with. And then as time went on, I got a bit bored because, I didn't, it was quite a spontaneous thing running off as I did. So I didn't have a work permit. And so I learned to milk cows and decided that I'd always been lactose intolerant my whole life. So I'd never drank milk my entire life either. So maybe that was part of the reason that I didn't really make the connection at all. But I remember the first inkling that I had that something wasn't quite right was when I went down one day at the end of milking and went to see the guys. They were all other men that were on the farm apart from me. And the farm owner, the cows were being milked across one side of the concrete yard, which wasn't a big yard. And then there was a little barn in which the farm owner would come down in the afternoon. And I saw him in the yard, and he was bottle feeding a tiny wee Jersey calf that was just sitting on the concrete. And I just thought, that's really weird. You've got the baby calves here, and you've got the mother cows there, and you're taking milk out of the mother cows, and you're putting that milk into a bottle and feeding the calf. Like, why don't you just leave it with the mother? Like, that didn't make any sense to me, and I thought it was really strange. And anyway, so I said to the farm owner, oh, can I feed her? She's so beautiful. Can I feed her? He said, oh, no, don't worry about it. He said, I'm going to knock it on the head after. And I was like, knock it on the head? What do you mean, knock it on the head? And he said, oh, it's too small to go on the bobby truck, so bobby calves. I don't know if this happens everywhere, but bobby calves, we're notorious for it in New Zealand that the newborn calves are, it's meant to be 4 days old if they're male or the wrong breed or the wrong color or whatever. But if they're surplus to requirements and not worth anything to the farmer, then they are sent to slaughter at 4 days old. But this wee one was too small even for that. And so, the reason that these calves get killed is because it costs too much in milk to be able to grow them and fatten them up to be able to get of the right weight to even go to slaughter. And so they're just killed using blunt force trauma. And so I just like, you can't do that. There's nothing wrong with it. Look how perfect it is, So I begged the farmer to let me keep her, and I paid $30 for her, and I actually raised her in my garden. We were friends. I would go sunbathing with her. I would lean up against her and read books and things like that. And she was my friend. I traveled to the other side of the world, and I didn't know another soul. And so we were very close. And I think if I'd stayed on the outskirts of farming like I was, it was like that connection was there. Why are they taking milk from here and feeding it to the calf this way? I think if I'd stayed on the outskirts, I would have made the connection a lot faster. But because I didn't, I ended up going deeper into farming life. By the time we left that farm, I was able to milk cows. I went on to milk 200 cows by myself. And I was rearing all of these calves, hundreds, thousands of cows over the years. I think that's why things just got buried. And even though I ended up being in the industry for 18 years, and even though, every time the bobby calf truck came twice a week, I would always cry right up until the end, right up until I left the industry. And there were so many things that I didn't like. I was always told, yes, we know it's sad, but this is how it is. You've got to get over it. And there were many times that I tried everything to get out of the industry, that I just felt it was cruel. It was depressing. I never saw a happy dairy farmer ever. We were all stressed to the max. People were depressed. Everything was just, full on. The pressure was insane. I don't remember raising my kids during that time. It's just a blur.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, everyone said, it's sad, but it's what we've got to do, because there's an understandable perspective that non-human animals in farms are completely objectified, right? They are products. They might as well be widgets or bricks or lumps of rock. That's all they really are. And there's a sense to which that's true. But I think what you're hinting at there, and I think this is also true, is that there's some degree to which the farmers and the farm workers do know that these are sentient beings that have experiences as well. So that it genuinely is a sense that it is sad and we sort of care, but this is the machine, and this is, there's this just inertia, this sense that it just has to continue, and it's so hard to do anything different. But I'm interested in how it and whether it changed the nature of your relationship with the cows, because obviously with the cow you took out of the system, you developed a really deep, close personal friendship. And as you went deeper into the industry, did you find that you were having to deliberately suppress and dull down your connection with the cows, or was it some other? How was your relationship with the average dairy cow? In the process, how did that feel different from the one with your friend?
I guess it was that getting to know her on a different level. Once I actually got into milking and got my work permit and we started climbing the farming ladder, it was just, I often think with people when they sort of say, why can't farmers see what they're doing? That a lot of the reason that they can't is because we don't have time to think about what we're doing. I remember eating sandwiches. Yeah, I remember, the following year when we went to a different farm and I was milking, twice as many cows. We were working up to 18 hours a day. I was eating sandwiches in the bath because we didn't have time to actually cook dinner, eat dinner, and get cleaned up. So you just go the whole time, and you don't even really get the time apart from a few brief seconds to really connect with an animal. And as a result, I had a very skewed version, I think, being female. And I know this is not just unique to me as well. I've spoken to others that have this skewed perspective of, this kind of sisterhood with the cows because they're female, and as women, we took pride in being kinder to our cows. We didn't yell at them, we didn't hit them, and we're just gentler with them. And so because I never drank milk in my life. And the thing that gets me the most, and I used to hate any part of taking the cows away from the cows. It was always me that had to drive the motorbike with the trailer and the crate on the back, while the other workers were picking up the cows and trying to get the calves rather, and trying to get the cows to follow. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. But I still, even when I lost Luke, which was during that time, that first couple of years on the farm, even though I'd lost a baby myself, and I knew that horrendous grief that you just never think that you're going to get over, and you never think that life can possibly be normal again. Even though that happened to me, I still didn't make that deep, deep connection that this is what we were doing to cows. And not just once like me, but year after year after year. I mean, there was a favorite cow on the farm that had been a pet cow long before I arrived on the scene. Her name was Tilly. She was 16 when she died. And that was, or should I say, she was sent to slaughter. She, even after 16 years of service, it wasn't natural causes. So she'd had 14 babies taken away from her. And I just remember, I would often think that dairy cows had the most wretched existence of any animal that I'd ever encountered. But I would see in Tilly every year, she was just so resigned to it that every time the farmers would come and get her calf, she'd just walk away. She wouldn't even try and, bellow, or she was just so resigned to it. And that was just so heartbreaking. I mean, now to think of what I was part of.
And some would say, and I've heard people say this, that that's because cows don't have a maternal bond with their calves, and
they absolutely do. They absolutely do. They want this. I mean, yeah, you hear of the ones, a few, like maybe a handful I ever encountered in my lifetime of cows that, did not want to bond with their calves and that rejected it. But let's face it, they didn't want to get pregnant in the first place. A lot of them are heifers, which means they haven't calved before, and it's just like, what the hell just happened here? I don't want that. That caused me a lot of pain there. And it was interesting. There was one thing that I did know. There was always these flickers of connection. Like you say, I always got dampened down. And in your recent interview with Erin Wing, when she was talking about animal suffering and how pigs would scream and things like that. In the case of a cow, if a cow is bellowing, if a cow is in pain, and if she makes a noise, she's suffering. That means she is in a hell of a lot of pain, because they're kind of like dogs in that, dogs, when a dog is in pain, you often don't know when a dog is really suffering. Cows are the same, because they don't, they might bellow when they're hungry or as a herd kind of mentality. But if she's out on her own, if she's sick, or if she's having, say, birthing difficulties or something like that, if that cow makes a noise, if she cries out, that the pain, it must be just horrendous. But every time, I just got dampened down. Yeah, this is how it has to be. And I never realized, I think because I was gentler with the cows, I never, it sounds so ridiculous now. I was vegetarian. I made the connection very early that, if I can't eat animals, because that means somebody died. Somebody had to die for me to eat them. And I don't want to do that. But I never made the connection with dairy and death. And it's so much worse. It's not just the cow that's dying. It's all of her offspring, or not all of them, but a good number of them. And the cow still dies at the end of it. And like you say, with farmers, they do have that. They have favorites. They have cows that are named. I've known farmers that cry and that have been really upset when they put their cows on the slaughter truck. But they think it's the way it's got to be. And it's like, don't you see you're the one that's actually got the power to change that? You've got hundreds of bloody acres here. You haven't got room for one 16-year-old cow just to live out her life in peace. I mean, that's another myth that I hear constantly about, cows only get to live until they're 5 years old. I mean, I knew a lot of 8 and 10-year-old cows as well. So
and I think it's like you said, there just wasn't space to reconsider or to think, because you're just on a treadmill and you're churning away. And it's probably also true that there weren't really many viable alternatives available to you. I mean, what are you going to do if you're a dairy farmer? You wake up one morning and go, I suddenly realise how terrible this is. What am I going to do instead? I mean, where's the option? And we'll come on to that when we start talking about the future. But I do find it fascinating, because through that period, it doesn't sound like your ethics were radically different from how they were, or maybe even how they are now. But you were just part of a machine and a system and a process and surrounded by social norms and cultures and way of doing things that meant you suppressed that and did the job, and on you went. So how did you find your way out of that? I guess putting those compassionate ethics, back into practice a bit more. What was the final stage of the journey to where you are now in terms of who matters and what you do about it?
I would love to say that, because people always want to know, what was it that turned you vegan? What flipped the switch when you were in the industry? There must have been some defining moment. There wasn't.
There's no heroic journey.
I wish there was. Hey, we always get there in the end.
I still think it's heroic, whether or not there was a distinctive turning point. But
I guess the key is what I do with that knowledge now. But people always want to know that. They always presume that I must have gone vegan while I was in the industry, and I wasn't. That didn't happen. I had to get out of the industry, and to be fair, get away from that marriage. But I ended up marrying the barman that I ran off with, and it was a deep family entrenchment as well. And it was always like, you don't like it, tough, just leave. And I didn't think that I could. I didn't know what else I would do. So it wasn't until I'd been out of the industry for probably about 4 years maybe less than that, but at the most anyway. And I met Gareth, my husband now. Met him buying parsley, so that was a good omen, wasn't it? That we were destined to become plant eaters. I was so broke. Gareth was working in the local hardware shop, and I was so broke, flat broke. I was raising 2 boys by myself, and I'd never had less. And I wanted to start growing my own vegetables in the garden to save money on food, because I couldn't afford to feed myself properly. I was giving everything to the boys, as you do. And so I thought, well, I can start with herbs. I might not be able to afford any plants, but I can start with herbs and get going that way. And so I went to Bunnings, which is kind of like a local hardware store, kind of like, I don't know, B&Q or something like that over there. I'm not quite sure, that sort of thing. And he sold me the parsley plant, and the rest, as they say, is
your
history.
Your eyes met across the parsley plant, and
it was absolutely like that. And so, and we ended up. I sold my house probably about a couple of years later. Sold my house, and we hit the road in a wee van. And so when we actually went vegan, we were living in a van at the time. It was 1.6 meters wide, 4 meters long. It wasn't a posh camper van at all. It was, it was a van, because the idea was I would sell the house and we'd go and buy land somewhere. And it just never happened, because we enjoyed living on the road so much. And so, but yeah, I never imagined. I mean, Gareth was someone that, he would make a pasta bake. And even when we were living in the van, there would be a half a kilo of molten gluten in the average van pasta bake. And but I'd never been anti-veganism, as a vegetarian. I'd never been anti-veganism, but I always thought it was extreme, because I thought it was a diet rather than a philosophy, rather than a way of life. And so I'd always been curious, but like Buddhism, oh no, it's far too much. You die. I mean, you only eat sort of goji berries and lettuce leaves. I mean, who can survive on that? But once I really got interested in it, I guess the wheels were already turning. And then one day I had a friend she'd been vegan for 25 years, and we were Facebook friends. And she was always posting things about the awful things that were happening to animals. And I didn't want to see. I thought about sort of unfollowing her, because I'd just be like, I don't want to see that first thing in the morning, woman. They're just going to ruin my day. So I'd be scrolling madly. And then one day I saw that she shared something, and it was a petition to ban farrowing crates. And I thought, oh, I can do that. I'll sign your petition. So I clicked in, and I saw what was happening in my own country. And it's always one of those things, isn't it? We always like to think in our own countries, oh, that sort of nasty thing doesn't happen here. And so I saw what was happening in New Zealand, which is still happening in New Zealand. SAFE has actually got a petition right now, still 5 years later, to ban those bloody farrowing crates.
Terrific.
And it's ridiculous, but that literally on the spot, I just realized, even though I'd never eaten pork and that kind of thing, I just thought, no, I can never be part of anything like that again. I can't contribute to any animal suffering again. And so that was it. I literally went vegan on the spot, started cooking vegan in the van. We were actually on a working sheep farm at the time. It was a campground, but it was also a working sheep farm. And so got a lot of stick for going vegan, and everyone imagined that I'd suddenly get very hard to live with and very preachy. And that it didn't really happen, because I was made a conscious effort. I didn't want to be like that. And I learned to laugh at myself very quickly. Gareth and I both did. That's his story to share. But that was, so everyone who says that social media posts don't work and that nobody listens, that you're just talking to an echo chamber, it's just a case of being open at that right time and just receiving the right message at the right time, I think. And so that was it for me. And I never, ever planned to be in activism. Like I said, my early experience with activism, my poor old dad, my poor elderly father.
Being hit with a stick.
That had me. Exactly. I thought all activists were like that they were, angry, extreme people. And it was only when I actually got into, sorry, you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's a nice lead into our final question about how do we think about the future. So we've sort of answered, what's real and what matters and who matters. And the final section is really, how do we make a better world? And you've obviously made this transition into, as you're implying, right, focusing on activism and outreach, and whether it's preachy or not, we'll find out. But so I'm interested in this section and in how people, what do people think a better world might look like? Is there some sort of utopian, more compassionate vision we can all look towards? What could that be? But then more pragmatically, how can we actually get there? And what are the best methods and approaches? And how optimistic or pessimistic are we? So yeah, that's a great way to sort of lead into how do you think about the future and how do you think we can make it better, given what you're working on now and your experience?
Oh, how can we make it better? There are a few avenues. I mean, for me, I became an activist because I realized, I was made to see rather, when I first went vegan, I knew nothing about veganism. I was in rural Southland, surrounded by sheep and, nobody really to bounce or learn from. And so I joined vegan groups. And when I actually let it slip that I had been a dairy farmer, they immediately said, you have to use your voice. You have to.
Yeah.
You've got an experience, you've got an insight that is so valuable that nobody else has got here, and you have to use it. And so,
I think one of the additional reasons why it's important is because there's this generic public view of factory farming, for example, and intensive farming and CAFOs, that almost everybody or lots of people will say, look, those are obviously terrible. We shouldn't support those. They're horrific, even while people, of course, continue to buy from them. But there's also this sense that there's this other thing, right? Humane farming, grass-fed farming, family farming, which is, happy cow marketing and blah, blah, blah. But it's the latter that you were working in, isn't it? I mean, it
Absolutely.
was rolling green fields and, from the outside, if you look at the right bits of the process, it probably did look pretty idyllic. But yeah, so that story, I can imagine them seizing on you and going, yes, we've got to tell this.
They really did. They really did. And they, you're so right. I was always on family farms. We're not talking thousands of cows here. We're talking, hundreds. And it makes me laugh when I see, grass-fed beef and stuff over here in New Zealand. Of course, it's bloody grass-fed. All of our cows are outside. We're too stingy to do anything else. I mean, we are a notoriously stingy country. And if there is an easier way, cheaper way to do something, we will do it. I mean, you had things like palm kernel and stuff coming in towards the latter years, but it's all grass fed. Like, don't buy into that. And like with the whole humane thing, the same thing still happen. They still end up going on the same trucks and ending up at the same place. Like, honestly,
the worst bits of the process for the animals still happen. Yeah,
absolutely,
just like on a factory farm. Yeah.
And honestly,
anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to divert you from your flow.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I mean, yeah, we could, it was. I still have flashbacks all the time. You can imagine, but and so yeah, I got into it that way. And the first thing that I got told to do, the activists put me in touch with a SAFE organization, and they asked if I would make a video talking about what it was like separating the cows and calves and what it was like for the cows. And so I said, well, I'm really quite terrified, because I know what the farming community was like, and I knew there'd be a backlash. So I said, you need to blank out my face, at least blur it out, distort my voice, and then I'll do it. And they did all that for me. And I still got death threats and, very graphic threats of violence and things like that. I was terrified. And Gareth said, no one's going to find you. We're in a bloody van. No one's going to find you. We're in the middle of nowhere, But it really put me off for a bit, knowing what we're up against. And so after that sort of, it silenced me for a while. And it was only one day I came across, I was still working. I was a travel writer. I've had a writing background as well for many years. And so I was in the van and just typing away, or I was on Facebook or something. And I saw this tiny wee ad came up about the size of a postage stamp from an organization called Vegan FTA. And they said that they were looking for volunteer writers. And I thought, oh, that's something that I can do. I might not be able to, I've lost my courage to speak and to be filmed speaking and to put my name to anything, but I can be anonymous. I can share what I know that way. And so that was how I got involved with Vegan FTA. And then as I learned more about not just the power I had, but the power that we all have as individuals. And I saw people like Earthling Ed standing up there, that he didn't have anywhere near the knowledge that I did of the experience of dairy farming, and yet he just didn't back down. He kept sharing his message because he knew that was what he had to do. And I thought, well, if he can do that, what's my excuse? And so that's where I found my voice finally. And since then, a lot of my focus has been on helping, build those bridges of communication with farmers and vegans, because I've seen them in a different light. I hate what they do. I wish they didn't all do it, but I've seen them as fathers. I've seen them as grandparents. I've seen them as family people. And I know that they are good people, good, hardworking people that are also a victim of this system, just as I was.
Yeah.
It is a horrible. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Milked documentary that is getting such great accolades over across the world now, which is brilliant. But it shows that, yes, the animals are by far the biggest victims of this, but it's not so much the farmers that are evil, but the industry that is just causing so much harm and in every way. And I think a vegan FTA, we're all about advocacy, we're all about activism, and it's promoting activism and encouraging and teaching activism right across the board.
Yeah.
You don't always have to be out there with placards and megaphones. There is a need for activism right across the board, and there is a need for more people like me. There are more farmers that are transitioning that can provide that insight. There's a wonderful one that I had the pleasure of meeting the other day, Lawrence Candy over in the UK. He's in Dorset. He's a wonderful chap that's just transitioning. He's gone from beef to oats. And it's people like that. Vegans need to listen. They need to listen to people like Lawrence and people like me if you want to move forward, because, butting heads and say, you're a bad person is not going to get anywhere. You have to see these people as humans, just as farmers aren't seeing who they are working with, who they are, with in close encounters every day. Vegans don't see farmers for the humans that they are as well. And there needs to be compassion on all levels and recognition on all levels. Because there was a lovely lady from Rebecca Knowles from Stock Free Farming. She was saying the other day, she's done extensive research in Scotland. And a lot of farmers, they would like to get out of animal farming. They don't want to be the bad guys ruining the planet and causing this suffering, but they can't. The main obstacle is funding. I mean, I knew farmers that were in their 30s that were, $4 million in debt by the time they're 30. Vegans just think that, transitioning is easy as just letting all your cows run free and plowing up your fields and planting some seeds and Bob's your uncle. It's not like that. I knew a farmer that was $4 million in debt by the time he was 30. I mean, he's the same age as me now. So goodness knows, and you're spending all that time growing your operation, going to the bank saying, I need more cows, I need more sheds, I need this, that, and the other thing. And then all of a sudden to go back to that bank whose relationship you've been nurturing for many years and saying, you know what? I've had a change of heart. I want to do it all differently now. And I want to, I need this, 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 and this. Yeah. What's the bank going to say?
Because I'm going to do hemp and mushrooms and oats and off we go.
Exactly. And talking to Lawrence, it's not easy. It's why there are people like Renee King Sonnen over in Rowdy Girl Sanctuary in the States that try and teach that, because it's taken a long time to grow these operations, generations for a lot of them. It's not just going to magically clear up and it's we're in it for the long haul, and we need to be mindful and real about that.
Yeah, I agree. And the discussion about persuading people to go vegan is quite well done over. There's the usual story about driving the ethics or the environmental or the health stories. There's the question of tone and how much empathy and how much hectoring and how much challenge we have. There's the question about whether vegan-centric media and social media is just preaching to the converted and we're all agreeing with each other, and are we really reaching new audiences? So I wouldn't suggest we spend a lot of time on that, because I think it's been well done over. But I think there's some interesting context that run across from the consumer story into the industry and the farmer story, because one, the consumers have powerful social norms. They were the way they're brought up, what they were taught was normal. Those things drive behavior as much as philosophizing and ethics do, as we all know. And in practical terms, so we have to understand that descriptively as we understand what it's like to be an average consumer around the world. But we also need to think practically, if we want consumers to take different decisions, about just the availability of viable choices. And often for consumers, it's availability, price, taste, experience, social acceptability, and if those choices are there and they're present and they're in front of you, all of a sudden things become so much easier. And as amateurishly, I sort of think it's similar from the farming and the industry perspective, because again, they've got social norms and a history and a family context and a tradition, all sorts of traditions around the world, and just a pattern of things they're doing that set the context for their choices. But in the same way, the choices are often extremely limited. As you implied, many farmers are sort of trapped in the system themselves. And for me to tweet at them from a distance to say, just, shut your farm down, become a sanctuary and grow hemp, it's not that simple. So in that context, as we're thinking about the idea of, just transitions and helping industries and individual farmers shift, one, it's not that simple. There's money, there's economic viability, there's practicalities, there's investment, there's all sorts of difficulties about how to make that happen. But also there's the breathtaking diversity of different transitions you need. Because if we're thinking globally, you're thinking about ranchers, you're thinking about all sorts of different flavors of animal agriculture, you're talking about fisheries, you're talking about more local sustenance-based animal agriculture, all the way through to the super industrial stuff as well. And obviously we can prioritize where we'd like to pick. But as we're thinking about trying to transition the industry itself, what are the main ways you think we can make that happen? Because it's got a scale, right? I mean, you've talked about some brilliant work: stock-free farming, right to advocacy program, Miyoko's Creamery. The list goes on.
Yes.
Transformation, Mercy for Animals, but they all feel very much like, here's a pilot here or there, and they've got brilliant stories. But we need to get from anecdotes to sort of massive systemic. We need thousands and tens of thousands of these stories. What do you have a sense of how we can make that shift happen?
It's a great question, and a huge question, because there must be so many ways. I mean, for me, I think we as vegans, we learn a lot about animals and what happens to animals. We learn a lot about the problem, but we don't necessarily. We're so focused on the animals that we're not always focused on the solutions, other than stop killing animals, stop eating animals, stop wearing animals, which is completely valid. But we need to know as much about the solutions, I believe, as those who are out there, like the transformations rather, the stock-free farmings. We need to know as much. I mean, when I was farming, we spent our lives going to back then it wasn't virtual, but conferences, webinars, things like that. And they're available to everybody. There's no reason why vegans can't go, even if you have to go incognito and just learn as much as you can. Because I mean, that was the thing when we were in Southland, when I went vegan. Like I said, we learned to laugh at ourselves quite quickly, because we knew that would disarm the people that would especially the farmers, that would otherwise think that, oh, they've changed, they're going to be preachy and, going to be up themselves now, and we're not going to be able to talk to them, And we ended up having some really good conversations, and they were really interested. But the problem was, I didn't have the answers. They would say, well, tell me what I can grow on those hills, and, tell me what I can grow on this land here. And I'd be like, well, I don't know. I don't know. And this is one of the things I believe that we need to know. Even if I just knew, I'm in the Wellington region. I mean, thankfully, there's not too much farming around here. I find it, I don't know how a lot of vegans and activists can live in places like Waikato and rural Canterbury, where it's just absolutely, you're surrounded by it. But, learning what you can grow in your area, because then you can be a brilliant advocate for animals, but you've also got to be a brilliant advocate for solutions. Because just passing the buck and sort of saying, this is your problem, you've got to do something about it. We need to work together. There's a wonderful sanctuary in the US, I think it might be in Canada, actually, beg your pardon, Farmhouse Garden Animal Home. And there was a young vegan, Edith Barabash, her name is, and she was just herself. She was, there was I think, third or fourth generation cattle ranch, and they would also grow organic vegetables. And she would go there on the weekends and just volunteer and help out at the vegetable market. And she went vegan, and just over the course of time, and she built up a relationship with the ranch owner, and they learned together. They would just have these conversations, and she influenced him so greatly. And he realized that he didn't want to slaughter his animals anymore. And so he did turn his farm into a sanctuary, and now he just focuses on, growing those organic vegetables. And she didn't preach. She didn't, they learned together. and said, let's work towards a better solution. I mean, that's just one example. Like you say, not everybody can be an animal sanctuary and just let the animals roam free.
That's inspiring. And I think I love the way you put that. We really need to focus on solutions, I think, much more strongly. And that's partly because we actually practically need to do it. But I think it will also help to persuade people it's something that we should do in the first place. Because unless you've got a viable path forward, it's much harder to persuade people that you've got a problem in the first place. Whereas if you've got a practical plan with a real option that you can lay out, it helps persuade as well. And there's an odd sense in which, in a way, it feels like we've almost won the ethical argument and the environmental argument is so overpowering as well, that if we can concentrate more on the solutions, it could really unlock a sort of latent potential to make a very rapid change. I don't want to be too naively optimistic, but if we can get that solution focus in place and really help. But I think the deeper reason why we need to focus on solutions is, as you've said, is we need, farmers are sentient beings too. They warrant our compassion. And that's one of the hardest things to do when you can see the wrong and you identify with the victim. But, there are other victims here too.
It's very hard to swallow. And a vegan FTA, it's our audience is very, we are vegan for the animals. We're very animal rights focused. And if we try and spread more of the climate message or the health and dietary message, our audience are not so receptive to it.
And I empathize with that as well. It feels like you're distracting from the core
absolutely
thing, but we're not talking to each other. We're not just talking to each other.
That's right. And it's got to be that we all know we don't have time. We have to work together. We have to collaborate. It's another thing that we're all about is collaboration. And we have to recognize that, we all have to work together, whether it's climate, health. It's a wholly encompassing thing if we're going to actually get through this,
I agree. And I think that's one of the other challenges about the view of veganism, even as a philosophy and as a movement, is that it is defined by trying to avoid, as far as practical and possible, causing the exploitation and ultimately suffering and death of sentient beings. Totally admirable. But in a sense, the end point of that philosophy is just a boycott. And that's not enough. It's not enough. It really isn't enough, because we need, as we've been talking about, solutions and driving systemic change. And I think that's partly why the movement as itself is recognizing that boycotting is just the start. We've also got to be activists for these systemic changes. And that's something we can do individually, but we need almost every level of institutional governance, from the UN through to regional governments, through to national governments, state and local governments as well, to be shifting this transition too, with money and policy, and that's something that we as activists can make happen, as well as boycotting, of course. But
definitely, I mean, can you imagine? I think the New Zealand dairy industry, or the New Zealand government props up our dairy industry by $12 billion a year. Just propping up the industry. They pay millions of dollars. I think it's $80 million a year just not to pollute Lake Rotorua and Lake Taupo, with farming runoff, with effluent. Can you imagine $12 billion a year if that was put into farmer transitions instead, and education and support? What difference that would make?
That's a big win.
And and we need, like you say, I do believe it comes down to compassion of everybody, and recognition and willingness to work with all sentient beings. Yes, we need to save the animals. Yes, we absolutely need to stop their suffering. But, I've realized you've had some wonderful guests on your show. You've had Christopher Sebastian, Laurie Kim Alexander, all of those. It's all sentient beings that we need to be, advocating for the end of all their oppression. The humans, we need to recognize our humans that are suffering as well.
And it's convenient in a sense that actually that's also the most productive, practical way of doing the best for the animals themselves, because otherwise we're just going to be butting our heads against a brick wall largely. And
that's the thing, yes, we need to save the animals. There's no question of that. But if we don't save the planet, then there ain't going to be no animals left either. We're all stuff, So it's like we have to see the bigger picture. We have to. And I think there's a wonderful, coming back to the whole Buddhism thing again, there's a wonderful there's an organization called Dharma Voices for Animals, and they've put out a wonderful film on YouTube, which is called Animals and the Buddha, because, we have a lot of people, if Buddhism's so great, why isn't the Dalai Lama vegan? It talks all about that.
Yeah.
It talks about the origins of what the Buddha actually taught. But this organization, I think the Buddhist community is about, I think it makes up 8 to 10% of the world's population. And what Dharma Voices for Animals are doing is going around to those communities, those temples, those monasteries, and teaching, this Animals for the Buddha film, teaching the lessons from that film to these communities. Because, can you imagine if the whole, 10% of the population was to transition from vegetarianism to veganism, and to actually, the ripple effect that could have as well. I mean, it's doing really important work, and so many people don't know about it, and they don't know the clout that these religions, for whatever you want to call it, for philosophies, they have a lot of clout as well. I mean, we need to get to that tipping point if we are going to see a kind of more vegan world.
That's another fascinating example of, you've got to meet people where they are and help them on a journey from where they are to wherever you're going. And it's particularly interesting for me, given this sentientism idea is explicitly naturalistic. So it is a non-religious way of thinking. And I think that's the best way of understanding the world. And I think it avoids some ethical, minefields and problems as well. But that doesn't mean I don't absolutely have a deep interest in helping people of a religious and supernatural persuasion finding their way towards a more compassionate future. One of my most recent conversations, I haven't released it yet, was with Lisa Kemmerer, and that's been the entire focus of her work and her activism. She's doesn't disclose her own sort of worldview personally, but she's been working with Christians and Jewish people and Muslims and Buddhists and Jains, across the East and Western suite of religions, and helping find things at the core of their religious philosophy that should lead them towards a more sentiocentric, ultimately vegan compassion. So, awesome. Lots of different journeys, even if we're maybe heading in this similar sort of direction.
I look forward to listening. And one thing I love about that film as well, you're talking about consumers, and I think it's, never underestimate the power you have as an individual. I think that people so underestimate their own power, their own influence. I mean, my friend influenced me to go vegan with a Facebook post. I've influenced Gareth, my husband, to go vegan, and he influenced his mother to go vegan, and a lot more, and we all have that power as individuals. And one thing that I love about this film Animals and the Buddha is that people don't realize how they're contributing, not just by buying meat today, but in the future, because it's that whole supply and demand thing. So you might go into a supermarket and be like, right, I want chicken for dinner, and it's Tuesday, so I'll, buy a chicken, take it home for dinner. You might not be planning to have chicken again next Tuesday, but that supermarket has already been like, right, well, we sold this many chickens on this Tuesday, so next Tuesday we need to make sure that we've got, it's that whole filling a demand. And we contribute that. The ripples,
flow out from all of our decisions for good or ill, and we shouldn't underestimate either.
Absolutely. So, that's what we're all about. That's what it needs to be about.
Yeah, I think so. Well, maybe that's an inspiring, empowering message to wrap up on. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation that we haven't covered so far? I could talk to you for hours, but I want to respect your morning as well.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, one thing that gives me a lot of peace, like I said, we're all on different journeys, and I don't have, said at the start, I'm not religious, but I do have a way of looking at the world. And the one thing that, I'm learning all the time, but the one thing that I've learned, the lesson from the Four Noble Truths ultimately, is that, all suffering, everything that arises, everything that is subject to arising also is subject to ceasing. And to me, that is how I cope with the world. I have flashbacks all the time. I found it very hard to live with when the penny dropped of what I've been apart with. And it's hard to live with what goes on in the world every day. I see the good around me, and I try not to think about the bigger picture, but there's no denying it's out there. But for me, for all the animals, for all the suffering that is out there, that is what keeps me going. Just knowing that, everything that arises also ends. And I really hope that is true for humans and animals, and for all of us, that the suffering will end. And I have to hold that keeps me going. I've got a hope. So I think we all do.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for your amazing work in trying to make that into a reality too. So what's the best way of people following you and Vegan FTA and keeping up with your work?
We're on all the usual platforms. So yeah, veganfta.com is our website. Obviously, Vegan FTA is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I think we're even on TikTok. I don't go there, but we are on there. We actually have a Vegan FTA Espanol platform as well, and even Vegan FTA Philippines. So we're growing, gradual vegan world domination. For me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, just Jackie Norman FTA. So I don't do a heck of a lot of social media, but I know the power of it because that's what has turned me vegan, and that is what my whole work revolves around now. So you can't discount social media, you know.
And it's amazing with a small focused team. You mentioned you've got an audience of 1.3 million people around the world now. So
that's right, we're getting up there now. Yes, yeah. So we spread messages in many different ways. Some people come to veganism through a cute animal rescue, whatever helps people connect. Like I said at the start, different messengers for different people. Not everybody likes Joey Carbstrong, not everybody likes Earthling Ed, but they might relate to a baby goat. Who knows? Whatever works. Whatever works. We try and cover it all.
Well, I'm trying to catch up with you. I think I hit 1,000 YouTube subscribers recently, so I'm a few orders of magnitude behind you, but we'll see if I can catch you up.
Oh, you will definitely, and we look forward to having you on Vegan FTA as well.
I'd love to be a guest, and put Gareth on as well, so we'll organise that.
He's very envious. I'll make sure he's out of his pajamas next time.
Brilliant. I can't believe you called him out on. We can always edit this out if you need. No, let's leave it in. It's been an absolute inspiration. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your life story and your thinking with us. It's been an honour to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Stay in touch.
Will do.